I had barely moved into that apartment. It was perfect. Everything within reach, and a view that made the city look like a sea of stars. But on the third night, the magic began to fade. It was always at 2 a.m, like a sinister clock. When the sound would start, the faint noise, almost a caress on the metal of the doorknob, as if someone was patiently trying to open the door. The first night, I tried to ignore it, assuming it was just a drunk neighbor or some old noise from the building. I turned over in bed, shrugged it off, and fell asleep. On the second night, I heard it again. It was the same sound, the same touch on the doorknob, but this time it lasted longer, with a bit more pressure, as if someone was really trying to get in. A shiver ran up my spine. Just paranoia, I thought. Maybe it was my own fear of being alone, but there was something about the sound, something precise and unbroken. I stayed in bed, motionless, counting the seconds until it stopped. By the third night, there was no doubt. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, every fiber of my body already waiting for the sound. And exactly at 2, it started again, stronger, as if the person was getting impatient. The doorknob turned, and the faint metallic noise tore through the silence of the hallway. I felt my chest tighten, my heart racing, but I decided to do something I'm not sure I'd have the courage to do again. I approached the door and, holding my breath, peeked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but the sound persisted. The silence out there felt like a weight, as if I were at the bottom of a dark well, and the echo of my heartbeat was the only thing alive. I couldn't see anyone, but the noise was there, a sound calling to me. The absence of any face, any figure, was worse than a scare. I sat by the door, wanting to understand what was happening, and the sound grew more insistent, a rhythmic knocking that pressed me against the cold wood. I wanted to pull my ear away, but the sound was enticing, almost as if it was calling me. Time seemed to freeze until, suddenly, everything stopped. Only silence remained, like a suppressed scream. When I finally got up, it was as if a weight had lifted off me, but the fear lingered. I spent the night trying to shake it off, trying to rationalize it, but the feeling that someone had been there wouldn't leave me in peace. In the morning, I went to the door to pick up the newspaper, but before I could touch it, I saw a note taped to the door, stained with something dirty, wet. My fingers trembled as I opened it, and there it was, a crude and direct message. I know you're there. Below the sentence, a smudged, dirty fingerprint, a dark mark that somehow seemed alive. Each letter, each mark, was a punch of fear, and I stood there frozen, unable to process, trying to understand. It didn't make sense. I barely knew anyone in the building, and the message seemed to mock my distress. Part of me wanted to run to the front desk, but I hesitated. What explanation would I have? How could I put that terror into words? The day passed in a blur. The note echoed in my mind, every noise amplified to the limit. When night came, I locked the door with every lock and braced a chair against it. By 2, I was already on high alert, and I could hardly believe it when the noise started again. This time, it was more aggressive, a constant push, as if someone wanted to break in. I sat on the bed, frozen, the sound of the doorknob turning filling the silence, but still too afraid to look through the peephole. I was terrified of what I might see, or might not see. I mustered the courage and put my ear to the door. On the other side, nothing but a dense, suffocating silence, as if it were waiting, calling. It was a silence that pressed down on me, almost like a presence. And then, as if the person knew I was there, the sound stopped. I stayed there, my face pressed to the door, listening to my own heartbeat, until I finally pulled away. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The silence, which should have been comforting, felt like a monster. When daylight came, the feeling of relief was only momentary. I opened the door and found another note. The letters were uneven, scribbled, and the message seemed even more threatening. I know you're alone. My entire body went cold, the weight of each word draining the last bit of calm I had. The fingerprint was even more marked, a stain that seemed to sink into the wood. I ran to the front desk, but the doorman just looked at me with disbelief, confused by my expression and my story. He said he hadn't seen anyone in the hallway or anyone lingering by the door. When he saw the notes, he only gave a nervous smile, trying to reassure me, but his words felt hollow. I returned to the apartment with the note still in my hands, and throughout the day, I avoided going out. At night, I pushed everything I could against the door and once again waited. At 2, the sound started again, this time with a dark force, as if testing the lock's limits. The idea of leaving haunted me, but at the same time, the thought of opening that door and facing whatever was on the other side seemed even worse. The next morning, just as the sun was barely rising, I found yet another note. This one was so crumpled and soaked, it almost disintegrated in my hands. The message was short and sharp. See you soon. And that handprint, dirtier and more blurred, now almost seemed to pulse against the wood. Since then, my routine has changed, and I avoid being alone there at night at all costs. But the memory of those sounds, those notes, never left me. It's as if a part of me is still there, at the door, stuck in the moment when that doorknob turned, waiting for something worse, something I might never understand, to happen. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to haunted houses and unexplainable phenomena. I grew up in the city, so stories about basements, old houses, and strange noises never got to me. In 2018, when I started living alone in a rented house, the idea of hauntings didn't even cross my mind. The house was simple, nothing special. Bedroom, living room, kitchen, and the basement. I only used the space to store some tools, boxes, and random junk from the previous tenant. From the beginning, I noticed that the basement window had a peculiar defect. Even after closing it tightly, it would always pop open 2 or 3 centimeters. I figured it was just a loose lock and thought I'd fix it later. The first few weeks were calm. I barely thought about the basement. I was always busy and just locked everything up at the end of the day. But when the cold arrived, one night, I felt a chilly draft down the hallway leading to the basement. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just in my head. But the house was strangely cold, like someone had left the front door open. When I went to check the basement, the air coming from there felt off, almost too cold. I opened the door and went down, just to make sure the window wasn't open again. And of course, there it was, wide open. As I got closer, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Muddy marks scattered across the cement floor of the basement. I thought they were just old stains, dirt, but it didn't take long to realize they were footprints, fresh ones. They looked like boot prints, and the detail that made my blood run cold was realizing their direction. They didn't go out. They came in from outside. my heart started racing. I looked around, trying to convince myself it was just paranoia, that maybe I'd stepped in some mud without noticing. But the more I looked, the more uncomfortable I felt. It was as if the basement, until then just a storage space, had changed, as if something was there. I followed the footprints with my eyes, and they led to the darkest corner of the basement, where an old metal cabinet stood. It had been there since I moved in. I rarely touched it. With each step toward it, the air grew thicker and the silence heavier. I already had my phone in hand, thinking about calling the police, but something in me hesitated, like I needed to see for myself before doing anything. I tried to convince myself there was probably nothing there, that at most, I'd find rats or some other creature that had come in through the open window. But as soon as I got close to the cabinet, I heard the sound of short, labored breathing coming from inside. In that instant, a chill ran down my spine, and my hands began to sweat as if I'd been plunged into ice. I froze. My heart was pounding so loudly it seemed to echo through the basement, like each beat was being observed. I tried to convince myself that this couldn't be real, that the idea of someone breathing just a few feet from me in the dark was absurd. A desperate urge to run took over, but another part of me refused to believe it. I took a deep breath, backed away from the cabinet, closed the basement door as quickly as I could, and ran to the living room to call the police. At that moment, all I knew was that I needed help. When the officers arrived, I explained everything, still shaking. They listened with a mix of curiosity and disbelief, but went down to the basement, armed with flashlights. I stayed at the top of the stairs, listening to the echo of their steps, the sound of the doorknob turning, and finally, the noise of something heavy being dragged. Soon after, there were murmurs and hurried footsteps. Within minutes, the officers emerged, accompanied by a man who looked like something out of a nightmare. He was covered in dirt, his clothes in tatters, his gaze empty, lost, as if he didn't even know where he was. When they asked him what he was doing there, he muttered, almost in a whisper, that he thought the house was abandoned and just wanted a place to stay. The police tried to question him, but he mumbled incoherent things, as if he was lost, not only in space, but in time. I could only watch, feeling my mind spinning, trying to process what I was seeing. Questions flooded my mind. How had he gotten in without me noticing? How many times had he hidden in the basement? And those footprints, had he done this before? Suddenly, I remembered all those times the basement window had been slightly open, a detail I'd ignored, now taking on a sinister meaning. All those times I'd thought it was just a faulty lock had, in reality, been opportunities for him to come and go freely in my house. As the police led him away, one of the officers gave me a solemn piece of advice: to change the locks and reinforce the house's security. He said cases like this weren't as uncommon as I might think, especially in rental houses, where the constant turnover of tenants makes it easier for intruders to slip in. When they left with the man, I closed the basement door and stood there for a moment, feeling the air change, as if the whole house had lost a layer of peace I hadn't known existed. I realized then that even if I changed every lock, I'd never be able to erase from my mind the idea that someone had been there, freely walking through the same rooms as I did. Since that day, I never walked through that house without the urge to check every corner twice, alert to anything slightly out of place. That night, even after the police had left, the the house felt strange, as if it was adjusting to the void left by the intruder. I paced back and forth, trying to shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still there. Any sound, even the smallest creak from the furniture or the wind outside, made my heart skip. It was already early morning by the time I forced myself to lie down, but the image of that dirty, lost man wouldn't leave my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, it was like hearing his breathing echo from the basement, a presence still lingering in the house. In the days that followed, I did everything to feel safe. Changed the locks, put a latch on the basement window, and installed a security camera at the entrance. But peace never fully returned. In the middle of the night, sometimes I'd wake up with the impression of footsteps coming from the basement. Faint, almost unreal, but enough to make me get up and check the basement door, just to make sure it was still locked. Over time, I began to avoid that space, letting everything down there gather dust. The thought of opening the door and facing what had happened there sent chills down my spine. A few weeks later, I mentioned the incident to the landlord. He listened with a look of surprise that gradually turned into something strange, almost as if he remembered something uncomfortable. That's when he mentioned that, in fact, the previous tenant had also complained about the basement window. He spoke reluctantly, saying the former tenant had mentioned movement down there, but at the time, no one paid much attention, assuming it was just wear and tear. Hearing this made me feel strange, as if the house held a secret, something that had always been there, waiting to be noticed. After that conversation, I started to feel as though I'd never truly been alone there. It's hard to explain, but it seemed like that intruder was just a manifestation of something bigger, a discomfort that the house held in silence. It wasn't long before I decided to move. Leaving was a relief no one could understand, and I didn't tell anyone the real reason. I left the house as it was, with the locks and latches, but with no desire to look back. Even now, when I remember the sound of that labored breathing from inside the cabinet, a chill runs down my spine, making me glance around, just to be sure I'm not being watched. I was never one to scare easily. I was always the friend who laughed at horror movies and loved dark stories. I'd stay up all night gaming on my computer. No fear, no paranoia. Back then, around 22 years old, I lived alone in a small house in such a quiet neighborhood that I didn't even bother locking the windows on hot nights. It always felt so safe, or so I thought. That night was as peaceful as always. The only sounds were the clicks of my keyboard and the game's soundtrack. I was so immersed that I didn't even notice the time passing. Then I heard a sound, a series of light, almost timid knocks coming from somewhere nearby. At first, I ignored it. I thought it was just in my head, maybe some noise from the street, or the late hour playing tricks on me. But the knocks came again, spaced out, deliberate, as if someone was patient enough to wait until I noticed. I glanced briefly at the window. All I could see was the monitor's reflection in the glass. I sighed, closed the blinds, and went back to my game, trying to convince myself it was just an ordinary sound, nothing to worry about. But then, the sound returned. This time, it was louder, rhythmic, unavoidable. And for the first time in that house, I felt a strange chill, a weight, like something I couldn't see was breaking the sense of safety I'd always felt there. I paused the game, trying to listen more closely, my heart pounding. It's nothing, I told myself. Probably just a branch, or some stupid neighbor. I took a deep breath and slowly opened a small gap in the blinds to peek outside. The cold air sent a shiver down my spine. And there, in the dark, someone was there. A man, standing, with his face practically pressed against the glass, watching me. His eyes looked blank, as if they held no life, and he was smiling. A twisted, frozen smile that made my blood run cold. Instinctively, I tried to close the window, but before I could, he pressed his hand against the glass, firmly, holding the narrow gap open. I was paralyzed, caught between panic and disbelief. It didn't make sense. Who would be in my yard at that hour, smiling like that, trying to get in? I wanted to speak, wanted to scream, but the words barely came out. What do you want?" I murmured, my throat dry, unable to look away from his eyes. He didn't respond. He just kept that terrifying smile as he pushed against the window, forcing it open bit by bit. My hands were trembling, my legs locked. If I didn't do something, he was going to get in. Finally, survival instinct kicked in. I pushed the window with all the strength I could muster, but he was strong, much stronger than he looked. Each time I tried to press the glass shut, he reacted with a silent force, his face coming closer and closer. Now, he was close enough that I could see details that stole my breath. His skin was a grayish, sickly tone, as if it hadn't seen sunlight in ages, and his hair clung to his scalp, damp in a way that repulsed me. His fingers, pressed against the glass, had long, filthy nails, scratching the glass as he pushed, almost as if he enjoyed watching me struggle. Fear was turning into desperation, and in a final effort, I let out a muffled scream and yanked the window closed, managing to lock it. For a moment, I felt a heavy relief in my chest, but it didn't last. Before I could react, he started pounding on the glass with a brutal force that made the whole house shake. Each thud sounded like a direct threat, and I felt my chest tighten, fear overwhelming me completely. I ran to turn off the lights, hoping that in the darkness he'd give up and leave. But the darkness only made things worse. The pounding continued. With each hit now, the sound was joined by something metallic scraping against the glass, as if he was trying to crack it. My heart was racing, and I realized that standing there would be the end of me. My eyes scanned the room, looking for anything I could use to defend myself. Near the desk was a wooden chair. I grabbed it, holding it with sweaty hands, and stood still in front of the window, hoping he'd see that I was ready. But he didn't seem intimidated. If anything, the pounding took on a new rhythm. He was testing the weak points of the window. I barely breathed. His figure moved from side to side outside, like a predator sniffing out a defenseless prey. Suddenly he stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the deafening noise of the pounding. I stayed motionless, trying to understand, trying to listen, each second feeling like an eternity. I peeked from the corner of the window, but all I saw was the darkness of the yard. Quiet, intense. Then, the sound cut through the air. The soft, torturous click of the back door handle turning. The noise echoed through the house like a warning, and I felt my stomach drop. He was testing another entrance now, and the precision, the way he seemed to know exactly where the doors and windows were, made my skin crawl, as if he knew the house better than I did. Without much thought, I ran to the kitchen and opened the drawer next to the sink, where I knew there was a knife. I gripped it with trembling hands, the cold handle pressing against my fingers, and went to the back door. The handle continued to turn, creaking again and again, the sound slicing through the silence like a blade. I stood there, knife raised, trying to summon the last bit of courage I had, while the terror told me this was far from over. I was there, locked in the bathroom, clutching the knife, my heart beating so hard it seemed to echo off the walls. Then suddenly, the handle stopped turning. Silence took over, but in a suffocating way, and I felt the air around me grow dense, almost impossible to breathe. I stayed still, trying to catch any sound, any hint of what he'd do next. Then I heard footsteps, dragging, slow, heading toward my bedroom. He seemed to be toying with me, appearing and disappearing, keeping me on edge, at the brink of despair. I made it to the bedroom door, where his silhouette stood once again, now without the twisted smile. There was something different in his expression, a frustrated, almost enraged look. For a second, our eyes met, and a chill ran from the top of my spine to the tips of my fingers. He raised his hand and began pounding on the window, this time with a violence that made the glass shudder. Each hit felt like a blow straight to my chest, and I knew I couldn't hold out much longer. Desperate, I grabbed my phone and called the police. My voice was shaking so badly, I had to explain what was happening several times. The operator told me to lock myself in a safe room and wait. Trembling, I locked myself in the bathroom, trying to steady my breathing. But even there, the pounding was inescapable. It felt like he was determined to get in at any cost. The sudden silence hit me like a punch. I stayed still, every muscle in my body tense, only hearing the muffled sound of my breathing. The relief was short-lived. Footsteps coming from the hallway. He was inside the house. I felt the panic rising, my skin prickling, and I tightened my grip on the knife with all my strength. He was getting closer, each step echoing in the quiet night, like a countdown. I closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable. Then, the sirens cut through the air, bringing such an intense wave of relief that my knees nearly buckled. The sound of the sirens grew louder, and in the background, I heard hurried noises, heavy footsteps. He was running. I waited, motionless, until voices and footsteps filled the entrance of the house. I took a deep breath and slowly opened the bathroom door, still clutching the knife in my shaking hands. The officers started searching the yard, shining their flashlights into the dark corners. Then, one of them spotted him, trying to hide behind a bush, just a few meters from where he'd spent so long terrorizing me. They immobilized him and quickly cuffed him. When he walked past me, escorted to the patrol car, I got one last look at him. The same pale skin, empty eyes, and a cold stare that made me shiver even more now under the light. He didn't say anything, but the look he gave me in that moment felt like a silent promise, a threat that would haunt my nightmares. Finally, the intruder was taken away, and the night ended. But to this day, when I close my eyes, I still see that face, and even though I know he's locked up, a part of me never truly escaped that terror. That night, I was home alone, something that hadn't happened since I got married and had kids. My wife had taken the children to visit her mother in another town, and I was trying to enjoy a rare moment of silence. It was almost 11 at night, and I was sprawled out on the couch, tired from work, but relieved by the quiet around me. The house was strangely silent, a heavy silence, as if every sound had been sucked out. I couldn't hear anything except my breathing and the dull thump of my heart, the kind of silence that only exists when a place is truly empty. There was something unsettling about it, as if that calmness was aware that I was there, alone, and wanted to remind me of that. I was nearly drifting off to sleep when I heard a sound coming from the back door. It was clear, the sound of a key turning, metal against metal. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but I knew I had locked everything as soon as it got dark, a nearly automatic habit. Even so, that cold, precise sound traveled through my body like a shock. I sat up on the couch, trying to figure out if I had really heard it, but soon curiosity gave way to fear. I got up and went to the kitchen, which led directly to the back door. As I approached, a chill ran down my spine, an uncomfortable feeling that I shouldn't be there, listening to that sound. When I arrived, I saw something that made my stomach turn. The door was unlocked. Impossible, I thought. I had checked every lock myself. But what truly left me paralyzed were the fresh fingerprints around the lock, damp smudges that looked like they had been left just moments before. The marks had an odd sheen, as if the hands were wet, maybe sweaty, or... I took a step back, smelling the metallic tang of my own fear. Whoever it was, they seemed calm, meticulous, as if they knew exactly what they were doing and where to find me. With my heart pounding in my chest, I grabbed my phone and called the police, trying to keep my voice as low as possible. I quickly explained the situation, and the dispatcher advised me to lock the door and wait in the living room, away from the windows. But the silence that had once been a sort of relief now felt like a weight enveloping me, squeezing my mind. I sat back on the couch, phone in hand, trying not to breathe too loudly. Every second felt like an eternity, and then, in the middle of that heavy silence, I heard something else. Footsteps. Soft footsteps, almost soundless, coming from the backyard. Those footsteps stirred a fear I had never felt before, a primal terror. I was standing in the place that had always been my refuge, and suddenly I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if any barrier between me and whoever was out there had been shattered. The steps were slow, almost dragging, as if whoever was out there was in no rush. They would come closer, then move away, as if the person was probing every spot in the yard, testing, searching, or maybe just trying to frighten me even more. I was frozen, fingers locked around my phone, feeling each sound as if it were a direct threat. For a moment, the footsteps stopped, and everything went silent again. The sudden absence of sound was almost blinding in its intensity. I thought about peeking out the kitchen window, but fear kept me rooted in place, unable to move, as if the smallest sound might give me away. I realized then that I was holding my breath, my lungs burning, as if that trapped air was my last line of defense. A suffocating weight of anxiety spread through my body as I waited, tense, not knowing what would come next. When I finally heard the distant sound of a siren, an immediate relief washed over me. But the relief was short-lived. The steps outside stopped, as if the intruder had heard it too and understood what it meant. As the siren drew closer, a stronger worry filled me. What if he tried to break in before the police arrived? Even with the back door locked, I couldn't remember if I had left any windows unlocked, any slight gap. When the flashing lights finally shone through the living room windows, I heard one more sound, a light scuffing of feet in the yard, followed by a complete cutting silence. I stayed frozen until the officers knocked on the door, and I rushed to open it, almost stumbling. As I explained what had happened, I felt a strange weight lift, but also a new unease. If they didn't find anything out there, I would never be certain of what had really happened. The police searched the yard, shining lights on every bush, every dark corner, up to the fence that separated our property from the neighbors. I stood at the kitchen door, gripping the frame to keep from shaking. One of the officers came back and asked me to show where I'd seen the fingerprints. Shining a flashlight on the lock, the marks were still there, fresh, clear. The officers exchanged glances, took some notes, but in the end said that without more evidence, all I could do was reinforce the locks and call again if anything else happened. After they left, I stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the back door and the fingerprints. The silence returned to fill the house, a heavy silence, as if the very structure were holding its breath along with me. I knew it would be impossible to sleep that night. I went upstairs, but left all the lights on downstairs and locked the bedroom door, something I had never done before. I tried convincing myself that maybe it had been a mistake. Maybe someone had just wandered into the yard by accident, but the image of those marks remained vivid in my mind. Someone had tried to get in, and somehow they knew I was there. I lay in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, but every tiny noise in the house felt amplified. In the early hours, I heard a faint creak from downstairs, coming from the direction of the back door. My body froze, muscles too tight to move. I lay there, heart racing, wondering if I had really locked everything properly. I didn't know if it was fear distorting my perception, or if someone was really there, but the thought of going down to check was simply impossible. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, each second stretching longer than the last, waiting, listening, until finally, the first light of dawn crept into the room. The daylight brought a small sense of security, but my body was still tense, as if something could happen at any moment. Slowly, I got up, went downstairs, each step heavy, feeling the cold floor beneath me. When I reached the back door, a wave of discomfort washed over me. The fingerprints were gone. The lock was clean, with no trace of anything, as if nothing had happened. I ran my hand over the surface, searching for any texture, any clue that the previous night had been real. There was nothing. It was as if everything had been a nightmare, but the memory was still too vivid for me to believe that. I looked at the door one last time before stepping away, the unease clinging to me, as if the space around me was watching, waiting for the next chance. I called my wife and told her, trying to downplay it, but she sensed the nervousness in my voice. We decided I wouldn't stay home alone the next few nights, and that once she and the kids returned, we'd install security cameras around the house. But even with that plan, what disturbed me most was the lingering feeling of being watched, as if someone out there had seeped into my gestures and knew my every move. I tried to keep myself busy throughout the day, but every little sound, no matter how minor, made me stop, alert. The silence, which had once brought me peace, had transformed into a constant reminder of that night, a presence surrounding me, eager to remind me of what happened. In the days that followed, we went ahead with the plan. My wife returned with the kids, and we installed cameras at the front door, the back door, and new locks on the windows. I thought these measures would finally bring peace, but the discomfort persisted, like a shadow clinging to me. I checked the cameras on my phone, but even when everything was clear, the unease didn't lessen. It felt as if the peace inside the house had been shattered forever, affecting me more than I wanted to admit. How could I explain to my family that simply being home no longer made me feel safe? It was only a week later that the last piece of this strange puzzle revealed itself. Reviewing the recordings out of curiosity, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The night before, a little past midnight, a figure had briefly appeared in the backyard. It wasn't clear, but I could make out the silhouette of someone standing, motionless, exactly where I had heard the footsteps that night. The figure stayed there for a few seconds, unmoving, then disappeared toward the fence. I called my wife over and showed her the recording. She fell silent, her face pale, and for the first time, I realized that she was scared too. After seeing that image, I called the police again and showed them the footage. This time, they took the situation more seriously and promised to increase night patrols on our street. But knowing that someone had actually been in our yard, that it wasn't just my imagination, added a new, almost tangible layer of discomfort. When night fell, the house seemed to change shape, as if every sound in the dark took on a different, heavier meaning. Even with the cameras and new locks, the thought that someone could be watching us from outside became a persistent paranoia. With time, things started to calm down. There were no more sightings on the cameras, no signs of attempted entry, and gradually we returned to our routine. But I never managed to feel completely safe again. Even now, whenever I'm alone, I check each lock 1, 2, 3 times before I can relax. And occasionally, I find myself watching that recording again, the image of that still figure in the yard, trying to catch any clue, anything that makes sense. I know I may never get a concrete answer, but one thing I'm certain of: the sense of security in my own home was a luxury I lost that night. And something tells me that no matter what I do, I may never fully get it back. I've always cherished my independence. Moving into this apartment a little over a year ago felt like the first real step toward being truly on my own. It's small but cozy, tucked away in a quiet pocket of the city. Nothing glamorous, but it suits me. At first, the silence of the building unnerved me. There are only a handful of residents, and most seem to vanish into their units like shadows. It was a silence so complete it almost felt unnatural. But eventually, I grew to appreciate it. The stillness became a sort of cocoon. Working from home, the apartment turned into my sanctuary, my bubble of control. I used to tell myself that as long as I stayed within these walls, nothing could touch me. Most days blurred together in a quiet rhythm. Wake up, make coffee, answer emails, and maybe sneak in an episode of something on Netflix if I had the time. The only slight irritation was the disorganization at the front desk. The doorman was kind, always eager to help, but there were moments when I wondered if the building's security was a bit too relaxed. I brushed it off until the calls started. The first came on a Tuesday. I was mid-sentence in an online meeting when my phone buzzed. A man's voice, calm yet oddly pressing, introduced himself as a maintenance technician for the building. He said there was a leak in my apartment, something he needed to check immediately. I frowned. Nothing had seemed off. No stains, no damp spots, no dripping sounds, but I didn't want to seem rude. "Did you speak to the doorman or management?" I asked. There was a pause. Then smoothly, he pivoted. "This is urgent. If it isn't resolved now, it could cause damage to your neighbors." His tone was polite, but uncomfortably insistent, like a waiter refusing to let you skip dessert. A chill prickled my skin. "I'm sorry," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I don't think that's necessary." I hung up before he could respond, but his words stayed with me long after the call ended. The calls didn't stop. Each one was more persistent than the last, and what unsettled me most were the details he slipped in. Details he couldn't possibly know. He mentioned my apartment number casually, like he'd been here before. He described the bathroom's exact location, even referenced the small balcony I rarely used. How could he know that? Paranoia began to creep in, a slow, suffocating fog. I went to the doorman, my voice low, trying not to sound hysterical. He shook his head, confused. No maintenance had been scheduled. "Ignore him," he said. "It's probably just a scam." I wanted to believe him. I tried. But the calls didn't stop, and the man's tone grew sharper, angrier, as if I was the one being unreasonable. "This isn't just about you," he hissed during the last call. "You're putting others at risk." Then came the knock. It was early afternoon, and I was chopping vegetables for lunch when the sound echoed through the apartment. A sharp, deliberate knock. I froze, my knife hovering over the cutting board. I wasn't expecting anyone. Creeping to the door, I pressed my eye to the peephole. A man stood there in a technician's uniform, a toolbox at his feet. My stomach clenched. It was him. Before I could say anything, he spoke. "Miss, I'm with maintenance. I need to check the leak. Now." His voice was calm, measured, but I could hear the edge beneath it, a coiled impatience. My throat tightened. "I haven't reported a leak," I said through the door, forcing my voice to sound firmer than I felt. "Please check with the doorman." The man sighed audibly. "If you don't let me in, the damage will only get worse." I kept the chain bolted, and my fingers curled around the lock. "You'll need to speak with the doorman," I repeated louder this time. After a pause, he turned and left, toolbox in hand. But the air didn't clear when he was gone. It thickened. I felt like I'd dodged something I couldn't name. The doorman confirmed what I already suspected. No technician had been sent. That night, I triple-checked the locks, stared at the door until my eyes burned. Still, sleep wouldn't come. Sometimes, in the silence of the early hours, I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, as though someone was pacing just outside my door. But whenever I looked through the peephole, the hallway was empty, stretching away like a trap with no escape. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was certainty. Someone was there, testing, waiting. A few nights later, just past midnight, I woke to a sound near the door. It was faint but unmistakable. A soft rattle, like someone testing the doorknob or gently pressing against the wood. My chest tightened. I lay frozen in bed, ears straining. When the sound came again, a subtle click, followed by a shallow scrape. My breath caught. I slid out of bed, barefoot on the cold floor, careful not to let the mattress creak. Each step toward the door felt like a mile. My heart hammered so loudly, I was sure whoever was on the other side could hear it. I leaned in, eye pressed to the peephole, but the hallway was empty, illuminated only by the dim overhead lights. Still, I couldn't shake the certainty. Someone was there, just beyond the door. I stood paralyzed, one hand on the lock, the other trembling at my side. The air felt heavier, pressing against my chest. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. But no other sounds came. Eventually, I retreated to the couch, turning off every light. I sat there for hours, every muscle taut, eyes fixed on the door as if sheer willpower could hold it shut. Nothing else happened that night, but the silence felt far from comforting. The next morning, I went straight to the front desk. This time, the doorman didn't brush me off. His expression turned serious as I explained what had happened. "Let me check the cameras," he said, disappearing into the back room. When he returned, his face was pale. "You need to see this." On the grainy footage, I saw him, the technician. He stood outside my door, motionless at first, like he was listening. Then he reached for the handle, testing it carefully, almost tenderly, before pulling out a small tool. My stomach churned. He wasn't lost. He wasn't confused. He knew exactly what he was doing. The doorman leaned closer to the screen. "I've seen him before," he muttered. "A couple of times, trying to get into other apartments, but he's never made it past the lobby until now." My legs felt weak. "How did he—" The doorman cut me off, already dialing the police. "Doesn't matter. He's not getting another chance." The wait for the officers felt endless. I sat in the lobby, nausea twisting my insides. My mind spiraled with questions. Had he been inside my apartment before? Was he watching me somehow? The officers arrived quickly, taking the footage as evidence. One of them, a seasoned-looking man, sighed as he turned to me. This happens more often than you'd think, especially in buildings with minimal security. They pose as workers, get access, and wait for the right moment. It wasn't reassuring. This was supposed to be my home, my safe place. But now, every creak, every shadow felt like a warning. A few days later, I got the news. The man had been arrested. He was a known scammer who targeted residential buildings. His routine chillingly simple: gain the trust of tenants, get inside, and take what he could. I should have felt relief, but it didn't erase the image of him standing outside my door in the dead of night. From then on, every noise in the hallway made me freeze. Every knock felt like a threat. Even though he was in jail, I couldn't stop myself from adding a second lock, installing a chain, and buying a camera for the hallway. The expense didn't matter. The fear outweighed everything. Sometimes, late at night, I found myself staring at the camera feed, waiting for movement, convincing myself I was being proactive. But deep down, I knew I was waiting for something I couldn't control. My apartment, once a haven, now felt like a fragile shell, barely keeping the outside world at bay. Even now, months later, I still can't let my guard down. I triple-check the locks before bed, listen for footsteps in the hallway, and avoid opening the door unless absolutely necessary. This experience left a mark, an awareness of how easily safety can shatter. And no matter how many locks I add or precautions I take, I know I'll never feel truly safe again.